Yeah, as was mentioned, my name's Alex. I'm on a team at Facebook called Data for Good. It's our job to find data sets within Facebook or data analysis capabilities that, when shared with partners such as the WHO, you could save more lives with them. So that's a very fun job, very large mandate. If nothing else from the presentation today, I think there's two things that I want to make sure that you have with you, so I want to start with them now. The first is that WHO has already completed the necessary data license agreement for you to have access to any of our program's data sets, even those that are non-public. To do this, we need to just generate a login for each of you as individuals. And to do that, it's very simple. You just email me. So my email address is here. It's just my first name, my surname at fb.com. So anyone with a WHO email address can be given access to any of our data sets. To do that, just email me. To find out what all of those data sets are, you can go to our program's website, dataforgood.fb.com. You can browse through. You can see examples of publications or case studies that have made use of the various data sets to hopefully inspire you. And we keep this updated all the time. There's a special page just for COVID-19 because in the last year or so, the program has really grown very quickly in response to this extremely large existential crisis response. So here is a quick view of all of those data sets kind of organized visually. We have kind of three main categories that are based on the source of the data that we're drawing upon to produce the data set for you all to use. So Maps for Good, which will be the focus of my training and discussion today, is what I lead. Surveys for Good is also extremely popular for COVID-19. The source of the data there is surveys conducted on our platform or where we refer people to third parties' platforms where they complete surveys. And Insights for Impact is the source of the data, very similar to CrowdTangle, is public posts on Facebook. Maps for Good, the source of the data can either be totally public data sets or geospatially isolated data on Facebook, either from users who have GPS enabled on Facebook or just by their profile data of where they are located. So to zoom in a little bit, the two data sets we'll talk about today, so I'm covering just a small slice, but these are the two most important data sets, I think, for COVID-19 response, is our population density estimates, which we call our high resolution settlement layer, specifically our estimates of where the population over the age of 60 lives. And then, as mentioned in the intro, our social connectedness index, which is really a geospatial layering of all the friendship ties on Facebook, and is perhaps the most unique data set we offer. It really could only be produced by a social network with the reach and size and user base of Facebook. So we'll spend all of our time on the social connectedness index. But to start, the high resolution settlement layer, as I mentioned, these are estimates of population density. What we do and how we build these are that we're combining two different publicly available data sources. The first is high resolution satellite imagery that we purchased from the company Digital Globe, now known as Maxar. And what we do is the same when you are in an airplane and you're taking off and you look out the window and you look down at the ground and you say, that's a building, that's a road, that's a light that is on. We're training a computer vision algorithm to do this exact same thing. And we break up the world into 30 meter by 30 meter squares. And we ask the algorithm then its confidence that it detected those things in those 30 meter by 30 meter cells. And you can see some examples here of what that looks like. I won't go into the full details, but if you're interested, please just reach out to me. We train our computational neural network at a sub-regional level because the nature of structures, the nature of roofs when you're looking from overhead, the density of those structures, and the nature of vegetation on the ground is obviously very different in many places around the world. So one model does not work comprehensively. And we can, discuss this in more detail if you happen to be interested in how to train models like this. So let's show you how that works. Here's a rural area in northeastern Namibia where I lived for 2 years, kind of my first job in the humanitarian space. It's mostly subsistence farmers who are living in homes made out of traditional materials. At the bottom of the screen, you can see a school. This is a hostel school, so the learners were living on the grounds of the school. This was like a more permanent structures with concrete and corrugated zinc roofs. And you can also see here in the top middle portion of the image, a very small health facility where there was several nurses, a handful of nurses who mostly worked on malaria prevention and delivering babies. So now let's see how our machine vision algorithm performs. We want to see how well it's able to find the 30 meter by 30 meter tiles that contain a building. So you can see that in purple. It's not perfect, it's missing a few, but there's very few false positives. There's very few places where there's a purple tile and there isn't a building found. And you can see it's doing a pretty good job down by the school where there's a denser collection of buildings, and you can see more purple tiles. So the algorithm actually, it kind of works differently than the human brain. What it is very certain of is where there are no buildings, we're kind of the opposite. Human brains are very good at detecting where there definitely are buildings. Now, what is this useful for? Well, we want to, instead of distributing census counts of population over entire census blocks, we instead take those counts and we divide them up only over these 30 meter by 30 meter tiles where there are buildings present. And this will produce a more accurate map of population density. It also allows us to carry forward all of the demographic disaggregations that are available in a census. So we can produce, a map of men, estimates of where men live versus women, where people over the age of 60 live versus those under the age of 60. But to do this for the entire globe, the image is very, very large. It's 1.7 petabytes. For most organizations or entities, even receiving a file that large is very difficult. But this is where Facebook's computational capabilities really come into play. For us, that's not such a big deal. It's still hard, but not too hard. And having the algorithm look at every 30 meter by 30 meter pixel also isn't so hard. It takes some time, but we can run the whole world in just a day or two. And so let's see how that results. So not just the village in Namibia, but the entire globe. Here is what we get. And we begin to color the map by the density of those tiles. And then we can remove the base layer, distribute the population, and what you're left with is an extremely accurate version or estimate of population density overall, seen here. And where it is particularly much more accurate than other estimates is in rural areas. This map outperforms other population density maps in places where there's very few people. In very, very dense urban areas, the map underperforms other commercially or publicly available estimates, and I'll speak more about that later. So perhaps let's zoom in to really see the granularity of those 30-meter estimates, which are very, very high resolution. Here is Nigeria, but just mapped by the population over the age of 60, and zooming in on dense urban area in Lagos, you get to see the different shades and density estimates. Here's some comparisons that were done. In the upper right, there's a QR code, which if you scan that with your mobile phone's camera, it will take you to the publication, which I've taken this image from. And in the lower right, if you scan that, it will take you to where you can access these data sets on UN OCHA's Humanitarian Data Exchange. We produce these without using any Facebook user data, so they are publicly available with an open license. And so you can access them now if you like. The paper, which was published earlier this year by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at University of Washington, mostly the group that works on the Malaria Atlas project. It compared population density estimates in the presence of a gold standard population density estimate for a very particular place, Bioko Island. This particular island's malaria eradication program has very, very almost bedroom level survey estimates of population density. So we have this unique gold standard for a small area, and we compare these three different available population density estimates and their relative accuracies. And so it's a very good way, it's a very generalizable methodology to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the various population density estimates. And ours outperforms, especially in the less dense areas, the other options. So now, how is this useful for COVID-19? In the lower left, there's a QR code which will take you to a link that is a full step-by-step tutorial. Even if you have never used GIS software, this particular visualization was used with an open source software called QGIS. If you want to just make those pretty maps of the population density that I've shown in the slides, you can do that with this software. This particular tutorial allows you to create a very simple mapping of a COVID-19 risk using two different publicly available data sets from Facebook Data for Good. One is that percentage elderly population. So what percentage of the population is over the age of 60, which we know for COVID-19 has an exponentially higher for morbidity with as a result of infection. And the other key input into our risk score is a metric that we surface in our movement range maps, which is the percent of the Facebook users we see present in a given day that were only present in a single 0.6 kilometer square tile. And we estimate that as the percent of the Facebook population that seems to be staying at home. And so the more people that are staying at home, the less risk for COVID-19 spread, but the larger share of the population which over the age of 60, the larger the risk for COVID-19 with this simple risk score. And what we do is compute that for every administrative unit in what's shown here is the Philippines, but these maps are available globally wherever we have enough users to protect privacy, in this case 300. And you can see the vast difference in this risk score, even in very proximate spatial or administrative units. And the more red there is usually where there's a low percentage of people staying at home, but also a large share of the population compared to adjacent areas is over the age of 60. And like I said, it's meant to be a complete beginner's guide. So if you've never used GIS or geospatial data sets before, this one should really walk you through that and make it very accessible. Even if you've never used anything beyond Microsoft Excel or a simple spreadsheet, I think you would be able to build this map with a bit of time, but it would take a bit more time than we have today, so I'll keep moving forward. I'll pause there for questions. I'm not sure if it's a good time or if we want to wait until the end, but yeah, just give everyone a moment to ask anything that comes to mind so far.
I have the slide of questions pulled up, so let me see if there are a few that are really key. So Noha had a question about basically, this is obviously data for good, but also like how's this data being, do you know how this data is being used? And can you comment on if there's any coordination whatsoever with national security agencies, particularly like if there's concern about them manipulating or misusing this data? Can you comment on that?
Sure. So our Data for Good program, we have two types of data sets in one sense. Some are fully public and those that are controlled access. So the fully public data sets can be used by anyone for any purpose. They either don't contain any Facebook user data at all, like the population density maps that I mentioned. This is very much akin to like if you went on Google Earth or Google Maps and zoomed in very closely. We're doing that at scale. There isn't much difference there. We don't release the data sets for sensitive geographies, like places where there's active conflicts or other reasons where the data could be misused or harmful. So those are not released. They're available to organizations such as WHO that are vetted and approved and complete a series of screenings. You have already done that, your central office. So we could give you those maps if you request them via email to me or my colleagues at the program. The controlled access data sets are not available for any government agency. They're only available for vetted academic research institutions and non-government organizations. The process by which that happens is different depending on the legal entity. For WHO, this was very complex. It took over a year for us to get those legal agreements signed and in place, but they're there now. For smaller organizations, it's typically much simpler. So for universities, it typically doesn't take as long. So in the instance, to be clear, there's no collaboration or work with national security agencies or any government agency of any kind. The goal here is to empower those organizations such as yourself who works with government entities all the time. And this is, to be honest, just to be very practical. It takes a very long time to set up a data sharing agreement with an entity like WHO. So a government entity, even the one with the best intentions, it would take a very, very long time, and that's not applicable for crisis response. What we want to do is empower those of you who already have the relationships, who are working with those agencies. Also, these are government agencies. Typically, this type of data might overwhelm them completely. And so we rely on you to distill this down, combine it with other sources of data. We know this is just one slice of the puzzle. You with the local context really understand that a lot more than us, and you can distill it down to the level that the government needs for its particular response. So our goal is to empower you, and we rely on you to solve those problems, to make this accessible for those agencies without overwhelming them. I hope that answers the question, but I'm happy to speak more about it if you reach out to me, or I know we'll have a batch of questions coming in that we don't have time to get to now.
Okay, and I would imagine that I think there's multiple variations on the question of how do we get access to the data, like how do we request, how do we, can my organization request access? How do I do that? So there's a lot of variations on that question, but I imagine that's well defined on the website.
Correct, or you can just email me. Like all of the data sets that I'm going into detail on today are publicly available on the UN OCHA's Humanitarian Data Exchange. If you just search for Facebook, you'll see all of these and more. So those ones you can access right now through the web. The controlled access ones, which I'm not covering today, but you can see on the website, you would just email me, or through the website at the bottom of each of the tool pages, there's a link to like request access or learn more.
Okay, great. Thanks. Back over to you.
Thanks so much for the questions. So the social connectedness index is what I wanted to cover next. This is a very simplified view of what Facebook is, but it's really people's online presence, and then they state their relationship with one another through something that's very familiar, where you send someone a friend request and they accept it. So some users have a friendship tie between them, and other users don't. These people are also, they have distance between themselves, like on the Earth's surface. We have estimates of where that might be based on their IP address, or if they enable the GPS on their mobile phone. That's not on by default by Facebook, but some small percentage of users, like between 15 and 25%, do enable GPS sharing with the app. And so there's both social relationship distance, like in a network theory sense of nodes and edges between users. And then there's also proximal or spatial distance between users. And so we're going to study those two different phenomena, the distance on a social scale between people on an aggregate level, and also their rough aggregate distance between one another, and produce a social connectedness index to help you study that in a geospatial sense. So just some quick looking at the distance between users. Here from the United States, you could do this for anywhere on Earth where we have enough users to measure, to protect privacy. What is the percentage of friends who live within 50 miles distance of the average Facebook user? And in many ways, what you're seeing here is similar to most maps. They reduce down to like a population density map, but there are some very curious phenomenon that are happening in places where there's where it's very white. There's these pockets of areas that are very blue, where a very small percentage of people live within 50 miles. Now, what might be causing this? It's because people's social networks are defined by things different than just the distance between where people live, just the overall population density. This has to do a lot with things that are very important for social mobility and socioeconomic status. And so a lot of these pockets of dense friendship ties, or sorry, least dense friendship ties in terms of distance, occur near universities, where a lot of people come for a time. They establish a network of friends during their studies, and then people tend to move away from that area. This would lead to places where people aren't living near a lot of a share of their friends. And what we found as we've studied this is that there's a lot of different relationships between many different socioeconomic statuses that are very telling. So in the upper left, if we think of average income, the mean household income for each of those county areas in the United States, graphed against the share of friends that live within a distance of 100 miles, we do see a very strong relationship. If you have most of your friends, or the larger share of friends that you have that are further away from you, typically the higher income you have. And if most of your friends are very, very close to you, that means that you likely have a lower average income. And again, this might be explained by things like higher education, the amount of time that you've spent in higher education. People with a higher socioeconomic status, at least in the United States that was studied in this paper, they might tend to move more often between or spend time in different areas. They might travel more and establish friendship ties in a larger dispersed geospatial area. And it's very interesting. Similarly, we can see that education, the level of no high school education, so these are grades 9 through 12 in the United States, so immediately it's like secondary school education. The share of the population with no secondary school education compared to the disbursement of friends is also is an inverse relationship to income. Similarly, birth rate has a strong correlation to this distance dispersion of friends, the density of friendships. The more likely you are to have friends, a larger share of your friends near you, the higher likelihood of teenage birth rates when we break this down by county. And the inverse relationship occurs across life expectancy. Here we're looking at the male life expectancy and the share of friends within an area. So just by looking at these simple distance relationships, there's a lot of interesting things which can be studied. There's been papers published that are linked on our website that look at these in more detail. Even things like how early people are to adopt new technologies, the likelihood of home ownership, the typical value of these home ownerships. A lot of this work is produced by a group at Facebook called our Core Data Science Team, which I work with closely. But what if we care more about this new concept of the network graph of friendship ties? We don't care necessarily much about the distance between people. That might be better studied with those very accurate population density maps, which aren't limited by the penetration of Facebook. And instead, we care more about the distance on the social graph. How many degrees away from a given person am I? And what is that social relationship distance between people? And when aggregated spatially, what can we learn from it for COVID-19? Before I go further, you can download the data right now. This is publicly available on HDX. If you scan the QR code in the upper right, you can go download it. There's 5 different versions of a social connectedness index available. I'm going to just work with the simplest one today, which is a comparison of the aggregate friendship ties between countries. So the other 4 are more granular spatial aggregations. Today, we're just going to work with the country-to-country social connectedness index. So let's return to our very simple Facebook friendship graph. So we have 6 individuals shown here, and their friendship ties now are what we're looking at with these orange lines. This is not the spatial distance between them. If 2 people are friends, then we just draw an edge between those 2 nodes. And to build, now let's calculate a social connectedness index with this 6-person Facebook. So maybe this is just like Mark Zuckerberg's dorm room back when Facebook started its very simple relationship. And we can see in this top left, the person who's maybe the most popular, they're friends with every other person on Facebook. But the person on the far right, they're only friends with one other person. And now let's say that they live in different places. We have region A, or county A, or country A represented on the left, country B in the middle, and country C on the right. How do we calculate a social connectedness index? Well, it's not very complicated mathematically. What we do is that we sum up all of the edges, so that is the number of friendship connections between 2 regions, and then we put that over the product of the number of users between the 2 places. And what this produces then is essentially a relative probability of friendship ties. So how likely is it that a user between any 2 regions would be friends with one another? That's what a social connectedness index is really saying. So let's calculate this for a few of our small countries, A, B, and C. So what do we think the social connectedness index is between country A and country B? Well, first we're going to sum up the total number of Facebook connections in the numerator. So that's just counting how many lines, how many edges connect country A and country B. So we have one at the top, one here, and one here at the bottom. So there's 4 different connections between country A and country B. So that's our numerator. And then how many users do we have in the first region? We have 3. And then how many users do we have in the second country, country B? That's 2. So our social connectedness index would just be 4/6 or 0.6 repeating. And that is the social connectedness index between those 2 countries, these fake countries. We can do the same between country A and country C. I'll go a little bit slowly in case you're doing this in your head. So how many connections total between the 2 countries? Well, I have one edge here between A and C, so I think that is just 1. And then the number of users in region A is 3, and the number of users in region C is 1. So then to fill in the formula, it looks like our social connectedness index here is just 1/3. And that's, again, when we think of that relative probability of friendship ties, think of it for our user here, this lone user in country C. There's 3 users in country A, and the relative probability of friendship is 1/3. They could have 3 different friends in that country, but they're friends with only one, the one that they're connected with by the orange line. So that's where the 1/3 comes from. And lastly, we can compute social connectedness indexes of a region with itself. And so that's like the level of social cohesion represented on the simple network graph internally. And so for region A with itself, we have 3 Facebook connections. Everyone is friends with themselves, or every user in country A is friends with every other user in country A. They're all connected, forms a triangle. And then we have just 3 users. We don't need to multiply that twice. So that's a 100% relative probability that if you live in country A, that you're connected with someone else in country A. So a simple concept draws directly from like basic network theory. And now we're going to do it on a very massive scale for Facebook, which is more or less global. There's a few places on the earth where Facebook isn't active. And there's many more than just 6 people. We have around 2.5 billion users now. And this is what it looks like if we do that on a map and we look at the percentiles of the social connectedness index between San Francisco County and the rest of the world. So what the data set ends up being is a very giant matrix of every single country with any other country, and then a relative probability of friendship ties between those countries. So here's what it looks like. So when we look at the United States, starting at the top of the alphabet with the ISO codes, between any 2 countries, we have a scaled social connectedness index value. To walk you through the steps in very simple detail, on our website, you can learn even more about this in detail if you'd like. First thing we do is that we need to exclude places where there's too few users to protect privacy. So if there's not 100 active Facebook users, that's certainly not going to be representative of any country's population. So we'll remove that one. We'll exclude the same sensitive regions that I talked about for the population density maps, anywhere where there's like active conflicts or other sensitivities that we would increase the risk. We remove those. Also, to protect privacy, we're not looking at every friendship tie. We're going to just take an 80% sample of all the friendship ties on the network, again, chosen randomly to preserve privacy. And then we add a bit of random noise to those total aggregate friendship counts between people We do this according to a differential privacy framework. I won't get into the details of that, but if you have an interest, we're drawing from a normal distribution, and our sigma in that normal distribution is 2. We then scale the values. So we don't want the countries with a high population on Facebook to overwhelm the network. We want this to be sort of normalized. So we scale between 0 and 1 billion. And so that means the 2 countries with the highest number of total friendship ties between them get a score of 1 billion. And the 2 countries with the lowest total number of friendship ties between them get a score of 0. And we always round to the nearest integer. And that's what produces this scaled SCI value. So again, it's a pretty simple data set, only 3 columns, and there's just 2 regions, and then a relative probability of friendship between them is the scaled social connectedness index. So just a fun exercise, what countries might you think in your head, based on that methodology, would have the highest scaled SCI value? What's the largest? Which one got that billion score after we scaled it? I'll give you just a minute while I take a sip of water to think what countries might be the 2 that have the highest SCI between them.
All right, we're monitoring folks' answers in Slido. So feel free to put your best guesses on Slido.
Well, here's a little drum roll, and here's the reveal. So this is the Seychelles. So Seychelles and Seychelles have the highest scaled social connectedness index between one another. And this makes kind of intuitive sense if you think through the methodology. It's a relatively small population that's much more likely to have friendship ties within them, probably caused by their unique geography, being an island nation, and a high percentage of Facebook penetration, and also probably cultural reasons that people might be just very likely to accept friendship requests from others on Facebook, very readily. There's a big difference in different cultures, like, oh, I would only accept a friendship tie if I've met the person in real life. That in some cultures, people feel that way, and others, they like, oh, they accept friendships from everyone. So cultural differences. Plus, I think this is a reflection of the true social networks. Of course, Facebook is just an online representation of people's real relationships on the ground. But probably in an island nation, you're more likely to know a larger percentage of the population. So it makes intuitive sense, and it's also just kind of fun to think about. So why is this useful? Well, or before we get into that, what is the distribution of those SCI values between 0 and 1 billion? I told you that we scaled between those. Well, it's a very, very uneven distribution. If we just plotted that raw in this histogram, you see that almost all 2 country pairs have a very, very low social connectedness index between them. So let's do a little bit of a job cleaning that up and remove the really, really small SCI values from that. But it's still a very, very uneven distribution. So there's a lot of nuance. That's why we scaled to 1 billion, so we wouldn't lose the resolution. It's a very long tail, a very slender tail. The vast majority of countries have a very small social connectedness index between them when you're scaled to up to 1 billion. But there's a lot of data that comes out of that. So I won't go into more detail of this. We already talked about the counties in the US, but just for fun, this is the social connectedness index of Washtenaw County, where I'm based now with the US. And what is interesting here is that it's really dominated after we have these immediate, the first 20 counties in the US are very strong social connectedness index scores to the county, probably caused mostly by distance. But then as we start moving outward, why is it that some places are green and others are completely white? There's basically no probability of friendship between the regions. And where I live in Washtenaw County, this is where the University of Michigan is. It's a very large public university. And so we see a lot of places where there's other universities like University of Illinois, University of Wisconsin, there's a much higher likelihood of friendship ties because of this like dominance of the academic and research sector, and people probably meeting one another in those professional circles. And then also urban areas like the San Francisco Bay County where I used to live. This is a lot of graduates from the university move there to work in the tech sector like I do. So there's a lot of interesting things that come out of this social connectedness index. And so if we study that relationship here on logarithmic scales, what is the relationship across counties in the US, the social connectedness index and the explicit geographic distance between them? There's clear trends, but as that distance becomes larger, the effect of social connectedness index becomes larger. We see these bumps after a log 7, and then it begins to flatten out. And so there's the studies of this really kind of find around the elasticity switches dramatically down when we're talking about distances over 200 miles. So within 200 miles of your location, your social connectedness index is going to really be dominated by the effect of the distance, and greater than 200 miles, the particulars of that region's social connectedness index become a bit more dominant and interesting. So why do we care about this? Obviously Facebook does, because that's all we are, is a social network, but why does it matter for COVID-19 and the WHO? Well, it turns out that COVID cases as a share of the population per 10,000 residents correlate pretty predictably with social connections. So it isn't just the spatial distance between regions where the virus is likely to spread, but it tends to spread within social networks, which isn't too counterintuitive, I don't think. You're more likely to meet people that are in your social network or spend time with them, which is exactly what a virus likes. It wants to jump from one person to another. And so it's more likely to transfer between you and people you spend time with than just random people in a random place, especially as distances become greater. And so this is a recent publication from researchers at NYU who actually helped us develop the social connectedness index. You can scan the QR code in the upper right and be taken to the publication to read in more details. But what they did was study 2 counties, one in the United States and one in Italy, that were they were initial hotspots with a lot of COVID-19 infections early on in the country's curve. And they studied the relationship of cases at a later date. I think it was several weeks, maybe 4 to 6 weeks later, against the social connectedness index with that county. And we can see those relationships plotted here, one with controls and one without. And so if you are a county with a larger social connectedness index to this Westchester County in New York, it was much more likely that you had higher case counts some number of weeks later. So the social connectedness index might be a very useful covariate layer for predicting or modeling the spread of COVID-19. And we see this as the primary reason that the WHO might be interested in it, beyond like those more lifestyle demographic things that I described earlier. And the same holds true for provinces with a social connectedness index score higher compared to the Lodi province in Italy. There was a higher number of cases based on the social connectedness index to that province. But even more so, another paper found that the influence on people's behavior, their likelihood of wearing protective masks, of hand washing behaviors, of social distancing behaviors. In this case, they were studying states within the United States. They saw that the likelihood of the similarities in these reported behaviors based on survey data could be attributed to strengths and high scores on the social connectedness index, even when correcting for factors such as distance, weather, and other environmental factors. So this means, if we're getting all the way down to like correlations in reported behaviors, that that policies enacted in one region have influence on the likelihood of people to have those behaviors in other regions. And so this speaks to the need for more coordinated responses in many senses, because what you do in one region has effects through people's social networks on other regions. And so if policies maybe aren't coordinated, then behaviors won't be as predictable. And that makes intuitive sense, I think. The paper does a much better job of explaining this. But you see in this, this flower graph here, between different states, which ones have these stronger linkages. So in the lower left, we have Iowa, a state that currently, it's basically only recently enacted any sort of mandated restriction related to mask wearing or social distancing. Schools were open, and there's a very strong linkage to Illinois, which is a nearby state, and similarly, most of the economies are dominated by agriculture. If we go to the opposite end of the side, we can see with California and New York, there's these strong linkages with one another, strong linkages between California and Texas, two states that had very, very different response policies. Very, very strong linkage between Florida and New York. This is mostly due to seasonal travel behaviors. A lot of people, when they retire in New York, move to Florida. And it makes intuitive sense that people's behaviors might be linked, because what they're seeing on social media, when they are more likely to see their friends in photos or talk about COVID-19, they're more likely to perhaps emulate those behaviors, even more so than the influence of the explicit policies that were set by the government or health agencies in those regions. So the likelihood that you would do certain things depends on your social network, is the finding of these researchers. It's a really fascinating paper. So I think then we are at time. I wanted to thank you for my attention and the level of function in my brain very early. We're still before 6 a.m. here in Washtenaw County. And just to reiterate the two most important things, if you want access to any of the data sets or help understanding the publicly available data sets, just reach out to me. I have a team of people that I'm working with. My email address is here. WHO, you've already done the hard parts. You've signed the legal agreements, so we can give you access to all of our mobility and our Maps for Good portfolio. And if you want to learn more about just the two data sets that I talked to you about today, you can explore that on our website and read a lot of these papers that are examples or research into the data sets and the types of efficacy that they might be able to perform. So I'll take as many questions as I can in the remaining time.